It turns out that when we become aware of what's going on, so in the example you gave, when you become aware of the changes that may be occurring in your body in response to some challenge that you're experiencing in the environment, that awareness itself is helpful in regulating that response. It turns out that when you are, this is actually research that we did quite a number of years ago in our lab. When fear is activated and you're unaware of what it is that activated the fear, you actually have a longer and more pronounced response to that fear than when you do become aware of it.
So it's almost like
It,
the uncertainty of it is amplifying the emotional response or perpetuating
it,
it.
exactly, exactly. And that we recover more quickly when we become aware of it. So awareness is, I think of it as a necessary precursor for any kind of change that's going to occur. So if we're going to recover more quickly, if we're going to change the way our body is responding, having the opportunity to become aware of it in the first place is really crucial. And this is where the meditative experience, I think, can play an enormously beneficial role.
So Richie, I woke up this morning and as part of my normal routine, as I did, I'm sure many people do, I was listening to a news podcast. And it was something, the kind of thing we hear every day. I was listening to something about the government and some departments being shut. And I just felt this wave of uncertainty rising up where it just feels like every day the ground is shifting under our feet, things that we thought we could just take for granted, like our democracy, the way our government is functioning. All of that suddenly seems up in the air. And I hear over and over again from so many people that there's just a lot of anxiety. People just don't know how to process all of this relative to even the amount of anxiety we had before with the pandemic, a million other things. So I thought we could maybe start with just diving into the science of uncertainty. What do we know about that? What happens in the brain when we feel this sense of groundlessness? And then maybe we can shift a little bit more into how we deal with that. What can we do differently so we don't feel so much anxiety and don't feel so overwhelmed by all of that? So first, what does the science say? I mean, I actually have memories when I was thinking about this of being back a grad student of yours in one of our seminars, and I remember reading about some research around uncertainty and even some, frankly, pretty nasty experiments that induce uncertainty in animals and kind of what that does. But you could pick it up there or anywhere. What's the science of uncertainty? What
Yeah,
do we know about it?
yeah. So thank you, Cort. There's a lot that has been studied about uncertainty, and we don't even need to go to those nasty animal experiments. You can do this actually quite benignly in humans, because it turns out that even the most mundane uncertainty, for example, if I were to present a tone, just a simple tone, and what was uncertain is simply the intervals at which it was presented. So you can present it at random intervals compared to presenting the identical tone at fixed intervals. It turns out that the brain responds completely differently. And one of the regions of the brain that is especially engaged in situations of uncertainty is the amygdala. And uncertainty uh, confers complexity um, for us as humans when we can't predict what's going to happen, particularly if we go back to our evolutionary past. Those are often situations that are potentially dangerous. And so it's adaptive to be vigilant during times of uncertainty so that we can more likely see or hear or detect in some way what might be occurring next in these situations where we simply cannot predict it. And the amygdala is a region of the brain that has amazing connectivity to almost all other areas of the brain. I remember as a graduate student seeing um, an image from neuroanatomical research showing the connections of the amygdala to other regions of the brain. And since I was a graduate student, um, that picture has become much more dense because more and more of these connections have been observed. But the amygdala is connected to virtually everything. It's a
And
huge
does that
hub.
mean, just out of curiosity? I mean, I've heard you say that and heard that in other contexts. Given that the amygdala is tied to emotional experiences and specifically to things like anxiety and fear and things like that, does that mean all of these inputs from other parts of the brain can activate those emotional experiences? Is that what that's telling? I mean, I'm sure it's a lot more complex than that, but one of the things that that interconnectivity is doing obviously can be
It
regulated as well. But what are the implications of that for just ordinary people?
there are two main implications. One is the one you're suggesting, which is that our amygdala can get triggered by anything, really. It can get triggered by uncertainty in the visual sphere. The example I gave was auditory, just sounds that are unpredictable. So that can activate the amygdala. The amygdala can be activated by touch, by taste, by smell.
And
All the
by the
five.
default mode network, I would assume as well, right? So our thoughts, like thoughts equally, it's not just the outside stuff, right?
Exactly. So it's the internal stuff as well, by thoughts, by bodily sensations. It is widely interconnected. But here's the other thing. The amygdala also has bidirectional connectivity. So it's not just that inputs from these different senses can trigger the amygdala, but the amygdala can trigger these different sensory regions. And actually, the back projections from the amygdala to the sensory regions are more extensive than the forward connections.
Hmm.
It's actually quite remarkable. In the human brain, the primary visual cortex is not directly connected to the amygdala in a feed forward way, but the back projection is directly connected.
Hmm.
So the amygdala can talk to the primary visual cortex, but the primary visual cortex can't directly talk to the amygdala. It talks to the amygdala through other secondary visual regions. But here's the implication of that. The implication of that is when the amygdala is activated, it colors how we see the world.
Hmm.
It colors how we hear the world. Our world becomes biased, if you will, becomes distorted as a consequence of the amygdala being activated. And so when the amygdala is being activated, our perception narrows, the aperture of our perception narrows, and it's focused on potential threats or potential sources of uncertainty.
So I hear, one of these endless tidbits of things that produce, this feeling of groundlessness or some righteous indignation or whatever it might be. It feels in that moment like it's this very simple thing, like stimulus response. I hear something and I suddenly have this emotional reaction. But what you're saying is then it starts going back the other way. So the amygdala is active. I'm taking something in from the sensory domain. These sensory regions of my brain are active. That then feeds into the amygdala that creates some, anxious response or whatever it might be. And now you're saying something quite different, where now actually the way I'm seeing the world is different, has changed by virtue of the fact that my amygdala is active. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you're getting that right. And it's not just that the amygdala has these back projections to sensory regions like the visual region or the auditory region, but also, as you're describing, when you have an emotional response, your body is activated. It may
Mm.
be that your breathing is changed so that you have increased respiration rate. It may be that your heartbeat is beating more strongly. We call that contractility, which is often what might occur. These bodily changes are also feeding back to different areas of the brain and modulating the brain, which further uh, distorts or colors the perceptions that we're having.
And that's exactly how it feels. It feels like a little spiral. It starts with some simple thing. You hear something or you remember something. Back in the day when I had a fear of public speaking, for example, I could just have a thought and it was like a little atom bomb in my mind and body, like this whole cascade of experiences. But it does feel like exactly that. It starts to influence other things, my body, my mind, my emotional state. And then maybe we could zero in on something you said. I think is super important, and you talk about it a lot. It's that our perception gets constrained. That's a really interesting one. I don't, in the moment, we just feel like we're just seeing the world as it is. But actually, what you're suggesting is probably actually not seeing things very clearly. Maybe you could dig into that. What's going on in the brain, and what do you even mean by that?
Yeah, so we can think of our perception having some aperture, and it doesn't affect any um, uh, specific sensory modality. It really affects all our sensory modalities, but we can see it very clearly in vision and in our auditory perception, where we can actually uh, study the range of perception. So in the visual sphere, for example, if something is presented in foveal vision, that means right in front of us. And something can be presented on the edges of our visual perception. We call that, in scientific terms, parafoveal. It's away from that central part of the retina. And it turns out that when fear is activated, it literally shrinks, it narrows this aperture so that we're less aware of
So
information.
this is
For
not
example,
metaphorical. We are
no, this is, yeah,
literally narrowing the scope. Like, I always
yeah,
think of it as like a great metaphor. You're actually saying that it literally narrows the field of our awareness.
it literally does. And there's really good evidence for that. And so that results in us being able to perceive certain things that are in that in that focus of our perception, but things that are outside of that aperture are absolutely unattended.
We're
They're
literally blind to them. I mean, we can't take
we're
them.
literally blind,
So,
literally blind.
if in the moment it feels like this is a personal failing, why am I getting upset again? Why am I getting anxious again? Why am I feeling stuck or paralyzed again? Whatever it is, it feels so personal, right? It feels like it's some personal defect of our mind. Obviously, we know from the data that everybody's feeling this. We're feeling this at a species level, and we've somehow created a world for ourselves that is constantly activating this. I wonder if you could talk about the evolutionary biology of this. So, like, why is this so normal? Why would this have been adaptive at one point? And maybe next we could then talk about what do we do with it, which hopefully or luckily there's some good news. But maybe first, why does this even happen at all? It clearly doesn't
Yeah,
feel good. It doesn't feel healthy or adaptive, obviously.
yeah. Yeah, so there are several things to say here. One is that the brain is a change detector. Um, it is especially good at noticing change. When something is unpredictable, when it's uncertain, that's when change really is happening. If we're at a steady state, everything is very predictable, change is not occurring, the brain sort of shuts off. If you will, or at least many parts of the brain shut off. And so scientists call that habituation. We habituate to information that is unchanging, but we orient to stimuli or situations that are more novel. And so another way to think about it is that the brain is a novelty detector. We're much more likely to detect things that are novel than things that are steady state. And that confers an advantage because when novel stuff occurs, it could be potentially deleterious. And we need to be attentive to that. And so, if there are threats in our environment that spring up unexpectedly, it's clearly adaptive for us to be able to notice those threats. What's really complicated in our situation today is that while sadly some humans are exposed to actual physical threats, for the vast majority of the human population, the threats that we face are actually internal threats. They're threats that we generate in our mind ourselves. And those threats, it turns out, hijack the same biological apparatus that physical threats activate. And so the same biology that would be engaged to respond to a potential physical uncertainty or threat in our environment is recruited when we have these thoughts or emotions that are unpredictable or anxious or fearful. And the biology gets reactivated.
Yeah,
And
I
what
noticed in that too, just to pick up on one thread there, again, thinking about earlier in life when I had a ton of anxiety, it was almost like this response would get stuck on the on, like switched on. And in reflecting on that now, I can see that a physical threat, you're out in the forest foraging thousands of years ago and there's a snake or a bear or something like that. It's something that's going to be resolved. Either you get eaten or you run away or you fight or you do something and it's going to end. Something's going to happen and it's going to resolve. And there's also almost like an energy, like you either have to run or you freeze, like you do something that it's almost as though it dissipates the energy in the nervous system, that nervous system response. And now we have these situations where there's nothing really to fight. There's if you freeze that it doesn't have that same adaptive response, it's almost unresolvable. And it feels like it just we're stuck in this state where our nervous systems are trying to respond to something, but clearly it's not an adaptive response anymore. We're just like stuck in the on mode all the time. Is that
Yeah, so I think you're hitting on something that's extremely important, and that is that with a physical threat, it's true that it resolves in one way or another. And if we are able to remove ourselves from the source of that physical threat, we typically come back down to baseline, if you will.
hmm.
But with the kinds of internal challenges that we're experiencing today, it's more difficult because they don't easily resolve in the same way that a physical threat resolves. And so it tends to create situations where there's more chronic activation. And chronic activation is very unhealthy. So it's adaptive to be able to have your heart rate elevated if you're running,
If you need
um,
to, yeah,
if you
exactly.
need to.
If you need to have that response. So another thing I wanted to check in about, I mean, we've both been meditating. You've been meditating like 50 years. I've been meditating more than 30 years because we've trained our minds, and I think this is true probably for most meditators, you start noticing these responses. When I first started meditating, one of the first things I noticed was what you pointed out earlier, which was that I noticed bodily changes in different situations. I noticed that my rate of breathing, even physical tension, I would hunch my shoulders in certain cases. I just started noticing my physiological response and what was going on in my nervous system. So now, because I've been doing this so long, in those moments when I have this response, I'm listening to something and it creates a moment of agitation or anger or sadness or fear, whatever. I immediately can step back and say, "Oh, what's going on?" I immediately notice what's going on in my body. And it's almost as though the awareness contracts, but then it widens again. And you can essentially train it to widen. You can train it to let in more information. And it feels like that. In the moment of contraction, I'm not at all aware of what's going on in my body. And it feels like I'm just seeing the world as it is, but really I'm seeing the world through this fearful, very negatively valenced lens. But then I start widening it. There's all sorts of information coming in again. So I wonder if you could speak to that. What happens in the brain when it goes from that moment of contraction, which I'm guessing is the amygdala is getting activated, and that's now feeding back into these other systems in the brain. But then you notice that this whole meditative process kicks in. What's going on then?
Yeah, so it turns out that when we become aware of what's going on, so in the example you gave, when you become aware of the changes that may be occurring in your body in response to some challenge that you're experiencing in the environment, that awareness itself is helpful in regulating that response. It turns out that when you are, this is actually research that we did quite a number of years ago in our lab. When fear is activated and you're unaware of what it is that activated the fear, uh, you actually have a longer and more pronounced response to that fear than when you do become aware of it.
So it's almost like
It
the uncertainty of it is amplifying the emotional response or perpetuating
it,
it.
Exactly, exactly. And that we recover more quickly when we become aware of it. So awareness is, I think of it as a necessary precursor for any kind of change that's going to occur. And um, uh, and so if we're going to recover more quickly, if we're going to change the way our body is responding, having the opportunity to become aware of it in the first place is really crucial. And this is where the meditative experience, I think, can play an enormously beneficial role.
So it seems strange when you sit down to learn to meditate. Many people probably start with either meditating on the breath, doing mindful breathing or breathing with awareness, or maybe a body scan. And it can feel so cut off from normal life. But actually, what we're doing is we're training ourselves so that in these moments where our nervous system is activated, we have these emotional reactions, we actually can not get so stuck and contracted and can and widen that. And is there, I mean, we know this experientially as people who practice this stuff, but does the science back that up?
Yeah, so these studies in our lab that I was alluding to are studies where we use experimental methods to manipulate whether a person is aware or not of something that's being presented. So one of the ways we do this is with some simple, clever behavioral methods. So you can present, for example, a fear face to a person, and you present it
They literally
very
just see a picture of somebody's face expressing the emotion of fear. That's what they're
right.
visually seeing.
That's what they're visually seeing. But then you immediately follow it with a picture of the same person with a neutral face. And so they get the fear face, and then immediately after they get the picture of the same person with simply a neutral face. So imagine if I were making a fear face, you would see it very briefly, and then uh, following that, my just neutral face. It turns out that if you do that and present the fear face for about 30 milliseconds, which is 31 thousandths of a second, you and then follow it by a neutral face for say 1 second, the phenomenological experience that you have is simply seeing the neutral face. You actually don't see the fear face. And so we call that backward masking in the neuroscience and psychology research literature. And it turns out that amazingly, that produces a greater response than if you just see the fear face for the full 1 second. Um, because you're now aware of it. I mean, this is just a very simple demonstration that awareness is kind of a key element of transformation. So simply being aware of the fear, it's totally counterintuitive because most people would think that if you're exposed to a fear face and
It's
you for
better
a
not to
longer
know
period of,
about it. If you can somehow keep it in the background or something,
yeah,
you would be better off.
yeah, and we show just the opposite. And you can measure the physiological response to it, and the physiological response to the fear face that you can't see is actually larger than the physiological response to the same fear face that you now can see,
You know,
amazingly.
that reminds me of an experience I had. I mean, you know well, Richie, that I've had heart issues and a lot of heart symptoms off and on for, I don't know, almost 20 years, more than 15 years. And it's scary. You know, it feels at times like my heart is totally malfunctioning. And when it happens, it can be very unsettling, especially when it started happening at the beginning and I I didn't know what was going on. And I remember having this feeling that the doctors were doing these tests. They weren't able to tell me what was causing it or whether or not it was dangerous. And I almost would have rather had a negative diagnosis where they just told me, like, okay, it is this symptom, it is this disorder or this illness or whatever, and it is dangerous. That almost would have been more reassuring than just not knowing at all.
Yeah.
And it was a
Yeah.
very weird situation. Like I didn't want bad news, but it was horrible. Like having to sit in that space. Is it dangerous? Is it not? Am I gonna die? Am I totally fine? Like that was kind of awful. And it just made me feel like uncertainty is actually the worst thing of all. Like when you just the not knowing. And I can see what you're saying now that our brains are constantly trying to predict what's going to happen. And it's doing that because we want to keep ourselves safe. We want to make sure we're in a safe space. And if there is a threat, we want to know it so we can get out of that threatening environment. And it's almost like when the whole thing short circuits, it can't accurately predict. It's like you almost like in a video game where you're like stuck in some weird like
Yeah.
limbo state, kind of vibrating back and forth, and you can't actually make any move. That's sort of the worst thing. And we can see that, leading to depression, anxiety, and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things that you said is really extremely important. And just to pick up on it and emphasize this, our brains really are prediction machines. They're constantly making predictions about what's going to happen in the future, and that's adaptive. We talked about this earlier. It's important for us to know what's going to happen so that we can prepare for it. And there are scientists that argue that our brains are literally constructing our future reality. And when input comes in, we're matching it to this predictive image that we have of what we're anticipating the world to be. And we're constantly comparing incoming input to this predictive modeling or predictive coding. And that's a key theory of how the brain is actually operating.
So that leaves it, I think, really the key question for us in this world that we're living in now, which is what do we do when we can't predict? What do we do in the face of all that uncertainty? Because it's just clear that we really don't know. I mean, to some degree, we can never predict, and it's always a prediction, right? It's always a matter of probability. But it seems especially unpredictable right now. Are we going to have a democracy a year from now? That would not have even been a question that we would have asked a decade ago. But now it's like that's a real question. Is the climate going to allow us to survive as a species in the coming decades? We really don't know. So the question is, what can we do in the face of that uncertainty when we simply can't predict and we're not going to be able to predict? I've noticed from my own practice, there's many things that help, but as I mentioned earlier, one of the simplest is just noticing the response that I have to that uncertainty, not even trying to change it. It usually does shift when I notice it, but that's not the point. It's more noticing the ripple effect in my body, noticing a very predictable loop of thoughts that can get triggered in my mind, and something that is just about noticing that seems like the starting point. I'm wondering if you could talk about the practical side. You talked about this earlier that it
Yeah, and one of the ways I often phrase that is um, we're not inviting people to change anything. We're inviting people to change their relationship to this. So it's not that the uncertainty is going to change, but they can change their relationship to the uncertainty in the way that you describe, so that they can notice what's going on and actually be aware of it. And as the research that I was alluding to earlier suggests, the elixir of awareness is really beneficial. It can really help to settle the body and the mind, and also lead um, to less perseverative activity. So one of the problems that we often face is that this uncertainty and anxiety just lingers, and so being able to be aware of it really can help. We may have anxiety initially when we first encounter the news or whatever a situation might be, but then we can come back down and simply rest in the sensations that we're experiencing in our body. And uh, as long as we're alive, we're going to have a body. And so that is a source of stability, if you will, and something that we always will be carrying around. And we always have the opportunity to uh, become in touch with what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such a game changer for me, and it really is as simple as to feel what you're feeling. It sounds so weird to say it that way because it's so simple. It's not easy to do necessarily, but so much of our lives are trying to get away from what we're actually feeling. We're trying to distract ourselves, we're trying to have different feelings, and this is simply bringing awareness to what you're actually feeling. I noticed when I started meditating, I was so up in my head. I was so scattered. I would sit down to follow my breath or do something simple, and I would immediately get lost in thoughts. And oftentimes I would get bored silly as well. It was hard just sitting still for a few minutes. I wasn't used to that. And I noticed that one very simple thing that I did was when I was feeling really bored or restless, I would shift my awareness from my breath and I would say, okay, well, what even is the feeling of boredom? What is that restless energy? Where do I feel it? What is it? Not to change it, as you said, but to change the relationship to it. And what I discovered is that actually that gave me a superpower of being immune to boredom. I feel like it's impossible for me to get bored now because if I ever experience anything even remotely resembling restlessness or boredom, I turn my attention to that and it becomes interesting. So it's almost as though the relationship, changes the whole inner dynamic such that that thing that was intolerable a moment before becomes fascinating and kind of interesting. And you don't need to do anything with it or change it. It's just your whole life becomes kind of interesting from that point of view. And I imagine what's going on is that I've changed the whole constellation of brain networks that are activating, even though the amygdala might be activating and I have some emotion, might have thoughts and other networks are activating, but there's other stuff that's coming online that reflects that widening of the aperture. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, so one of the things that I often uh, invite people to reflect on in terms of how the brain is changed by these practices is to think of the brain as a set of interacting networks. A network is a cluster of regions that are working together to accomplish some function. And um, they are physically connected through actual wiring, neuronal connections, and they're functionally connected so that functional activation caused by some activity. So, for example, if we're looking at a visual object, our visual cortex is activated. When that activation happens, then it spreads through this network that may be a network involved in visual perception. And so these networks are all interdependent. They're communicating with each other. They're constantly changing and interacting. And what meditation does primarily is it's changing the connectivity among these networks. So it may eventually change the networks themselves, but initially the primary change is changes in how these networks are interacting. And so, for example, one of the common instructions in simple forms of mindfulness or awareness practice is um, uh, if you are aware of your breathing and your mind is lost, you may have the instruction to gently return to the breathing once you notice your mind is lost. And you can do that over and over again. And it turns out that that act of returning your mind to the object of awareness is something that requires an interaction among probably three brain networks. One network we call the salience network, another network we call the central executive network, and a third network we call the default mode network. And the default mode network, just very briefly, is what is active when you're not doing um, uh, when you're not very active, when you
When you're
are
not like engaging your mental resources, you're not focusing or some mental task, right?
exactly. So if you're instructed to simply rest, very ambiguous instruction, you would be exhibiting this default mode.
And usually,
This
just to clarify, that's usually tied to thinking, right? You're thinking and usually thinking about yourself and your life.
right, and it's often tied to mind wandering.
Hmm.
Uh, the salience network includes the amygdala, and it's the network that's important uh, for labeling things that are salient, that are emotionally significant. So if you hear your name called in a cocktail party and you orient toward that, that's your salience network. We're typically interested in ourselves.
Is
Um,
it the noticing, the labeling of it, or is it doing both of those together?
it's not so much the labeling, it's the initial orienting toward it
It's
that
that like you
really,
notice, like you weren't noticing
right.
something and suddenly you do. It's that.
Ex-
So, but there's something in that of choosing, like there's something that drives what to notice and what not to notice. Is that all happening in the salience network?
Yeah, the salience network is particularly important for what we call stimulus captured attention. So if you hear an ambulance outside, um, that's a very loud auditory stimulus. Your attention would be pulled toward it. You didn't choose to attend to the ambulance. Your attention is being pulled toward it. That's stimulus captured. That is the salience network.
But what about, just a second ago, I noticed my breath as I do a gazillion times every day because I've been doing that meditation for a long time. When I notice my breath, because I've conditioned myself to do that, is that also the salience network?
Um, Not clear. I
We
mean,
don't
that's a
know.
good
The
question. We
science,
don't
the
know.
jury's out.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I would say the jury's out on that. Yeah. Uh, So the third network, just to finish this picture, is the central executive network. So when I notice my mind is lost and I bring it back to the breathing, that requires the activity of the central executive network. And it turns out that research shows that the connectivity between the central executive network and the default network is changed by meditation. And it actually doesn't take much. We can see changes in the functional connections and even in the white matter tracks that are physically connecting these networks. We can see changes in as little as about 25 to 30 hours of meditation practice among people who are just beginning.
And we are now actively doing, at the Center for Healthy Minds, research where we're looking even at lower dosages, so to speak, of meditation, people who are doing 4 or 5 minutes, sometimes not even every day. And we're seeing a lot of changes. We're not really looking at the brains in some of these studies that we're currently doing. What would your hypothesis be? Would your hypothesis be that in these, we're seeing, changes on the order of 20 to 30% reductions and improvements in depression, anxiety, stress, perceived stress, things like that? Do you think that would also be tied to these kinds of changes in the brain that you're talking about, or do you think it takes more?
I think that there are, with sensitive enough instruments with the right kind of measures, I believe that changes have to be occurring because there are changes in behavior and in other aspects of biology. And if those changes are occurring, there are going to be changes in the brain.
Hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that those changes in the brain are going to endure unless people continue to practice. And this is really an important point. People often ask us, well, are these changes enduring? Are they permanent? And although the data is not really available to answer this definitively, my hunch is that they're not permanent at all.
So it's like
Um,
working out. If you jog every day for a week, you're certainly going to have see all sorts of changes in the physical body. But if then you stop after that week and look a year later, you're likely not going to see much difference. It's going to revert back to the baseline. But if you kept exercising over time, you likely would see those changes and even more pronounced. Is it pretty much the same thing?
exactly, exactly. And I think that's a perfect analogy. Yeah.
So maybe we could round out this discussion with the practical side of this. You and I are both students not only of the science and the research in this area, but we've been practicing this stuff. I wonder if you could just share what you do in your life to deal with all of the uncertainty and the stress and anxiety that it can provoke. I mean, you're in a world, in fact, we are both, but especially you, are in the academic world, which right now is experiencing uncertainty like it hasn't experienced. I mean, I don't even know all the federal funding for research, even the public trust in science and scientific research. And there's all sorts of practical implications of that, which are very real in the sense of people's jobs, people's livelihoods, having the funding to continue doing the kind of work we do. So there's a lot of uncertainty in your life. That's just one dimension of it. What do you do? How do you, like in a practical level, maybe just share what helps you deal with all of this?
Well, first, let me start by acknowledging that it's hard. I mean, it is hard. We are living in unprecedented times. And there is just a constant, assault, I would use the word to really describe it because it's relentless every day. Um, and so, I'm very, very grateful to my practice. I think if I didn't have my practice, it would be much, much more challenging.
And by
I've been
practice, you mean like a
medit
formal sitting meditation where you put your butt down on a cushion every morning and meditate. That's what you're.
Yeah, so I've been putting my butt down on a cushion every morning for roughly the past 50 years. I may have missed a few days when I have a 6 a.m. flight, but other than that, it's been every day. And for me, it's super important. And actually, uh, over the last uh, period of time, for roughly the last 6 months, I've also been meditating at night. Which is, sometimes I've meditated twice a day in my daily life, but now I'm doing it regularly, which is also helpful. Um, and, but I also, when I'm in the midst of the thick of things, I'm constantly reminded uh, um, of what we in the tradition that we practice in call the view. And this is a set of understandings, if you will, that things are going to change. They're not always permanent. That there is such a thing as innate basic goodness, and that people are actually good in their true inner selves. They may have learned to do terrible things, and we can condemn in the strongest possible terms what they do, but they're human beings. And they're likely doing it because they're confused, or they're deluded, or they're misinformed. Uh, and so that helps me to not just go off the rails and curse at them, but really just to see them as being products of this kind of um, misunderstanding. And it helps lower the temperature. And then the other thing is that I have this just enormous gratitude for the people that I work with, the opportunities that we're being given, and the chance to actually do some meaningful good in the world, um, in whatever small ways we can. And so that gives me a lot of vitality and really restores my hope. And I do have this unshakable confidence that plasticity is possible. And that comes from both personal experience and from science.
Which is to
And
say, change is possible for those.
thank you. Yeah. So change is possible, and change does happen. And so when I think about the current social and political climate we're in, it's horrible, but it's not going to be this way forever. It's going to change, and those reflections really help me get through this, and help to infuse my everyday life with a sense of meaning and purpose.
And what do you, in addition to formal daily practice, and I completely agree, having had a regular practice for 30 years, and especially going back to the beginning when I started meditating, it was remarkable to me. There was maybe 6 months or so where I was on again, off again, and it was beneficial and it was helpful. And at a certain point, I just started doing it every day. In fact, I started meditating twice a day for 20 minutes because that was the instruction I had. And the world was a different place after a few months of doing that. It was dramatically different. It so radically changed my experience, especially anxiety and stress. I just knew this was going to be something that would be at the center of my life, which of course it has. So formal practice, no question, is incredibly beneficial. At some point, we should talk about retreat because having times, even if it's a half a day or a day to be immersed is also incredibly helpful. I'm curious what you do off the cushion, so to speak, when you're out in the world. And I imagine that you still get triggered now and then, or something happens that it just triggers a response or triggers a flood of thoughts. What's your go-to inner game, inner script that you run in those moments when you're just out in the world and something happens that you just triggers you, whatever your default emotional response is?
Yeah, it happens a lot. I mean, I was with a repair guy yesterday who came to the house, and he was very talkative, and I had very little time, and I needed to meet with him and to do what I needed to do with him, and then get on to the next thing. And I was late for a meeting, and he was just very talkative, uh, uh, and at some point, I was feeling my own agitation. I noticed it in my body. I clearly recognized that I was getting agitated. And he was actually, he was being a very nice guy, and he was, and I just suddenly, just the whole perspective shift. I recognized, wow, he's really trying to be helpful to me. And he is a professional doing what he's doing. And he's really a nice person. And really, and I started just feeling appreciation for him, and gratitude. And there was still a little agitation there because I did need to move on, but it really changed the whole interaction. I settled down, and I gave him a nice handshake on the way out and thanked him for all he was doing. And I mean, it's just a little simple thing like that, but those things happen every day. They're very common. Uh, and the being able to tune into how you're feeling, to recognize that most often people really are motivated by good things, by the right things. It may come out in a way that is annoying or irritating, but their motivation may be good. And recognizing that can be enormously helpful.
Yeah, I have exactly the same experience. And what you're pointing to, which is very much the case with me as well, many, many times every day, it's just that pause. And it's not even a pause in your physical activity or even mental activity. It's more like a little opening of inner space where I just check in with what's going on, especially if there's a shift, if I suddenly am feeling something strongly that I wasn't a moment before. and taking that moment simply to check in. And I think for me, the key is awareness infused with curiosity, because my default mental state, I would say, is more judgmental, where I can not only have a moment of awareness, but it's paired with that's right or wrong or good or bad, or and then it, spills over into something else. But just like a kid in the forest playing around and getting curious about everything they see, it's just noticing, oh, that's interesting. Look what is going on in my body right now. Look what thoughts are pouring through my mind right now. And you don't even have to change what you're doing. I mean, right now, as I'm talking, I can do this. I can be talking and noticing what's my physiological state, what's my mental state. People are listening. They can be just noticing the rhythm of their breath or noticing tension in their body. And that little thing, even if you just do it for a few moments, but you repeat that many times throughout your day, total game changer. I mean, you're just rewiring your brain to function in a radically different way. So in any case, I appreciate Richie. This has been a fascinating conversation in with all the uncertainty that we're facing these days. I have no doubt that people really will benefit from everything you shared today. So thank you for taking a few moments to geek out with me.
Thank you, Cort, and thank you for all you're doing. Really appreciate it.